Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us again for this five-part webinar series on strategic applications of cognitive rigor. Today, I'm going to be presenting one of my favorite pieces of this puzzle, which is using rigor for instruction. The very first week, we looked at the outcome and purpose of rigor. Last week, we looked at standards, using rigor for standards, and this week, we're looking at using rigor for instruction. So our first learning intention is to explore the use of rigor as it pertains to various instructional strategies, to evaluate rigor within an instructional strategy chart. And this is really a nifty, useful tool that I like to use with teachers so that they can really keep their learning along the way. And it helps them to have, a flashback memory of, Brandon did this strategy 6 months ago. Here's what it looks like. Here's the why, when, where, how to use this. Very helpful tool. And then last, we're going to look at Cogno again in terms of stage 2. Last week, we looked at stage 1, where we prioritize the standards. And stage 2 gets into how do I plan for instruction. So remember, there's going to be a Q&A at the very end of this, but I want to respect everyone's time. So remember that you can download any of the cognitive rigor matrices, but in this webinar, I'm going to be showing each usable cognitive rigor matrix as we get to it. When I think about the idea of instruction and cognitive rigor, what really differentiates cognitive rigor is that we are looking at not only cognition, but the affective components of socio-emotional learning as it pertains to how students take in information. So we know, based on Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, that the first thing someone is able to do is to receive new information when they're learning. In other words, use the 5 senses, and they can actually receive that information. But stage 2 is then to respond to that information, or level 2, responding to that, giving some kind of response. I like this, I don't like this, but getting to that level of value is what's critical. Now, there are actually 5 levels of Bloom's affective taxonomy. Past value, there's prioritizing by value. In other words, I think this tree is great, I think this fruit is great, I think this equation is great. And then the brain is shuffling all day long and saying, hey, this is much more important than this is. And then the 5th level is living by that value. But what we know about learning, and this is based on the brain research of researchers at Johns Hopkins and Eric Jensen teaching with the brain in mind, and Sternberg, Driscoll, cognitive information processing, is that in order for students to actually keep information and not just learn something for a test, they must value the information. They must be connected to it in some way, shape, or form, so that they say, hey, this is one of these things that I'm going to prioritize. Therefore, as the teacher, I know that if I'm checking to find out if students are valuing the information, possibly through formative assessment, then we can permeate the affective filter. And it's only by permeating the affective filter that we get short-term memory. But what's the problem with short-term memory? It's short. So we have to do something with it. We have to rehearse, we have to encode. Here's all these levels of cognitive rigor that are happening during the encoding process. And finally, it gets to long-term memory, where it then becomes malleable and connected to all these other pieces of information that are prioritized. If this is the case for learning, then what has to happen in terms of rigor is that teachers need to present a 3-phase cycle of what happens in the instructional process. So the first part that needs to happen is before. Before instruction, it's the beginning. We could say 1, 2, 3, before, during, after, but this is the before of instruction, where there's no new learning, only connecting to local relevance, only connecting to background. And it's not until we get to the during of instruction that we actually see cognitive rigor start to build for students. And in that after, that it actually happens where we get to some higher levels of really digesting the information and getting to higher levels of rigor. So what happens in this is that at the teaching level, here's what teachers are doing before, during, after. And cognitively, students are connecting to it socio-emotionally, and then they are cognitively increasing their levels of rigor as they actually value the information. So if this is the case, then we need to look at what happens with the rigor of various instructional strategies. So before I start this, I'm gonna do a poll today, and the last 2 weeks, last week this went really well, but if you will, on your phone, text Brandon D575 to 37607. Go ahead and do that right now so that you can participate in the poll. And if you've been successful with this, then you'll see this pop up. And some of you may not have disconnected from last week, so you're already connected to it. So here's my first question for you. When you think of the word strategy, what other words and thoughts come to mind for you? I'll give you a couple minutes on this one. All right, so it seems to be settling right around there. Action is huge here and has been texted the most times than planned. So with a strategy, we're really looking at something that is an action that the teacher is going to take to get there. And one of my favorite definitions, not the definition, because all of these answers are correct, right? These are all, you know, tactics, roads, schedule, structure. These are all the things that are part of a strategy. But for Angela Perry, as she talks about instructional strategies, she says that they are the actions of the teacher intended to lift the cognition of students in relation to a specific learning goal. So in this case, it's probably a learning standard, a standard that they're trying to meet the goal for. And strategies are really the methods by which the teacher increases student learning. They're over time, as they are moving through the cognitive rigor matrices and through the matrix to move down and to the right, they're actually increasing the cognition, lifting the cognition of students. So we know that the most important influence on student learning is the quality of teaching. So this is really huge, and notice that it's, you know, quoted by Danielson, Schmoker, Darling Hammond, Marzano, all of these talking about the single most important influence is the quality of teaching. So the issue that I have with teaching is not just that we have best practices, but that we have replicable best practices. So what's really important about strategies is actually naming them. In other words, I can't come in and say, oh, you know, I do that thing where I stand at the front and then I give them the maps and then they color it. That is not necessarily a replicable practice that someone else can take and understand how they're lifting the cognition of students. So I want to look at that intentionality and that explicit lifting of cognition that happens when we're looking at cognitive rigor. The first strategy I want to examine is a math strategy. And this is a structure that I use called RAT math, or reading and thinking math. It is adapted from Nessel and Graham's thinking strategies for student achievement. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a word problem And for the sentences that we have in the word problem, as the learner, I'm just going to stop and I'm not going to worry about getting it right. I'm just going to go through it. I'm going to say, okay, based on these sentences, what are the operations that I believe are required for me to be successful with this problem? So the lawn mowing chore problem begins that at my house, summer vacation means added chores for my 3 sons. So there's my first number, 3, right? Every Saturday, the lawn must be mowed. Mark starts the mower and he completes a third of the lawn. Sam takes over and mows exactly a quarter of the lawn. And Josh finishes off the last 700 square feet of the lawn. What's the area of my lawn? Now, what happens to students is they see these word problems, and a lot of times they see a mountain instead of a ladder. And so what this does is sets up a structure for them. So as they're going through this word problem, they can actually see, here are the operations I might be able to use. And they're going through and filtering all the way towards the end until they get to that place where they really have a clear understanding. So the first 2 sentences read, at my house, summer vacation means added chores for my 3 sons. Every Saturday, the lawn must be mowed. So the only thing I'm thinking here is maybe I'm going to be adding up my 3 sons. It's the only number that I have to work with in the first 2 sentences. So that's kind of where I'm going to go with this one for myself. The third sentence says, Mark starts the mower and completes a third of the lawn. So I may have to be subtracting out what Mark does as he first starts out, because there's a third of the lawn, but I've got another 2/3 of the lawn that I've got to think about, right? So the fourth sentence says, Sam, the next son, then takes over and he mows exactly a quarter of the lawn. So now I've got the possibility of addition and subtraction, possibly division, because I'm going to have to divide up this lawn. And I know that definitely after seeing the third and the fourth sentence that I'm definitely dealing with fractions, right? The fifth sentence says, Josh finishes off the last 700 square feet of the lawn. So now I'm thinking, probably, addition, subtraction, maybe multiplying something, maybe dividing something, but definitely dealing with fractions. Once it asks, what's the area of the lawn? I know that I'm going to have to set up Mark and Sam and their part, which is that 1/3 plus 1/4. And then I've got Josh, which is a totally different entity of that 700 square feet. So by the end, I know I've got 2 fractions that I'm going to have to deal with in order to figure out what happens in this particular problem. So as we solve this, we're going to convert those fractions to 4/12 and 3/12 from 1/3 and 1/4, or 7/12. So there's Mark and Sam's part, right? And they have something that equals, X percent or X square feet of this lawn, right? The next thing is I'm going to have to take that part that Josh has, and I know that I have a total of 12 parts of this lawn because I've got 7/12, but I've got to figure out Josh's part, which is actually 5/12. So you notice that we have the 7 up here. We have to get the inverse of that to figure out what Josh's part of the lawn is. So Josh's part is only 5/12. 5/12 equals 700 over X, so the total part of the lawn. 700 is Josh's part, so what's the total part? Which is what I'm trying to get to. So we end up multiplying 700 times 12, dividing all of that by 5, and we find out that the lawn is 1,680 square feet. Now, what students do when they do RAP math is they finish the first couple of sentences, write their operations down, and maybe they turn and talk with the neighbor about what they've chosen and why they've chosen it. And they keep going through this process until they get to the end where they say, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to have these 2 fractions. And I've got to find out what the total square area of this. So let's look at the levels of rigor that this goes to. When this strategy of RAP math starts, it's really just starting up here at DOK 1, Bloom level 2, understand. I'm just evaluating the expression, kind of going through and making, just making some guesses, maybe making some conjectures about what operations I'm going to be using. Eventually, I start to get to here where I'm having to select a procedure according to the criterion performant. But if the teacher really takes it to the full potential, it can actually get all the way to DOK3, strategic thinking and evaluation. If the student's actually checking their work and having to verify the reasonableness, why is it reasonable that it's 1,680 square feet? Why is that reasonable? Why is 5/12 reasonable for Josh? You know, so when they start answering some of that questions, they're really thinking strategically about what they're doing. So I've modeled this one. Now I'm going to show you some strategies and ask you to participate and really think about what those bloom levels are. And the last thing I want to say about this is we want to remember that the standard is what determines the rigor for instruction. It determines where that potential should go. So remember, during this webinar, we're just looking at strategies in isolation. We're just looking for what's the potential of this strategy as its highest level. So list group label is another great strategy. I just take a lot of Post-it notes, put them, you know, where students can then sort them into groups. So you could think about, you know, different types of fish, different types of birds, different types of, you know, animals, different types of continents, anything like that. And then find the specific words and get them to group and sort those words as they're going through. So all they're doing is sorting, classifying what it is that they're doing. So here's my strategy review chart. This is the tool that I use when I'm working with teachers. So the first thing I think of is, what is it going to look like? If I have to look at this 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, what's going to help me remember what list group label was? And I'm going to think of words on Post-its. Different people put different things into this box based on who they or what they think this actually looks like and what's going to be their memory trigger for this. What do I have to remember to do as the teacher? I need to time it. I need to remind students it's not about getting it right when they're going through the first sort. They need to group the words and label the groups that they choose. And then the best use for this, and remember that before, during, after I showed before, this is a before strategy and an after strategy. So I can give this to students, have them do the sort, then they go read a piece of text, then they come back and they do the list group label again and make adjustments. Right? And so it's a before and after strategy. The comments are, how am I going to use this myself as the teacher? How am I going to internalize this? So I'm going to use this to introduce my next unit on metrics as a math teacher. So I may have some math things that I put in there in terms of, you know, Fahrenheit, Celsius, millimeters, any, you know, all kinds of different words that are mathematical going to metrics that are going to help students remember this. Now, what we want to do is, notice I've left blank cognitive rigor, or the process of that Bloom and DOK level. So in list group label, I want you to look at the matrix for reading, and I want you to make a notation for yourself before I have you vote on it of what's the DOK and Bloom level. So just make a little note for yourself, because then I'm going to put the poll up and let's see how everyone does on this one. So list group label, what's the DOK level first? And then second, what is the Bloom level? So that way we find that intersection. Okay, so let's start with the DOK level. Where do we think that DOK level is for list group label? Okay, so about 50% of us at the DOK2, 50% at DOK3, and you're going to notice, especially if you participated last week, you're just going to get better and better at your estimations of this. And again, that's why I want to continue to say, this is why it's so important for teachers to have these conversations in teacher teams to talk about where standards are going and where the instruction is going. So it's much more explicit and intentional. So that DOK level, somewhere 50-50, DOK 2 to 3. Let's look at the Bloom level. What do we think the Bloom level of this standard is? Okay, so we have 100% at understand. All right, let's go and look at this. All right, when we look at list group label, we start to get over here to this DOK2, which is conceptual thinking, and analyze Bloom 4, because what we're doing is we're actually sorting, classifying, and labeling. So that word categorize is my trigger that lets me know that's where this standard is, that's where this instructional strategy is going towards, is towards this DOK2 Bloom level 4 area. So when I go back to my strategy review chart, I'm going to put in DOK2 Bloom 4 analyze. So that way I have that strategy banked. I've got it put away. That way, if I want to come back to it, use it later, try to remember it, try to share it as a team, it becomes a replicable strategy because it has nomenclature. It has a name to it that we're actually able to use. Here's keyword notes. Keyword notes is a takeoff on Cornell notes. I take a short article, I chunk it into 4 pieces. I have students get into groups of 2. And then I ask them to choose 3 words from whatever paragraph they're reading that will help them to remember what they said. They then put the article down. Person A talks to person B. They tell them the 3 words they chose and why they chose them. Then person B tells person A the 3 words they chose and why they chose them. And then they move on to the next paragraph. All right. And they do this 4 times, right? But each time they're finishing, they're writing a summary using these words that they've chosen in the boxes over here. So we have the choosing of words, we have the conversation that's happening, and then we have the summarizing. In the strategy review chart, my primitive, or what it looks like, would be word cues for memory and then summarization. I'd have to remember as the teacher, I need to time it. You have this long to talk, person A, person B, you have this long to talk, you have this long to summarize, maybe extend the time. Best use is during. This is a during instruction strategy. And I might use this to read a new article on growth in science. So I might have a unit coming up where I'm going to be looking at growth of something, maybe cells or something. And I'm going to use this to just get students into it so that they're processing. Now, as you look at keyword notes, jot down for yourself, what do you think the DOK and Bloom level is for this? Okay, so what's the DOK for keyword notes? What is the potential of this strategy? So this is why this is so fascinating to me. Notice we have, about 2/3 of us believe that it's at the DOK2 level. Some of us, about a third of us, believe it's at the DOK3 level. And that's why these conversations become so critical, that we're actually having them to talk about where a standard is going and what instruction matches that standard as we're going through the process. So what about the bloom level? Where do we see the bloom level of this strategy? What's the potential for the strategy? Okay, so notice the level of variance. We have about 50% of us believing it's at the 2 level of understand, and 50% of us believing it's at the evaluate level, or Bloom 5. So let's look at this, right? So we know that in keyword notes, as we just start choosing the words and we're doing those top boxes, just that by itself, all by ourselves, we're just selecting appropriate words to use when intended meaning definition is clearly evident, right? We know what those words are, right? But when we get over here, we've got that word summarize results. That word summarize is starting to come up. And the pair share conversation starts to take it all the way to there. So this is why it makes sense that in our results, we had a lot of people choosing DOK2, Bloom level 2. But this is what I want to show you. And it depends, of course, on the level of text complexity. It also depends on, what the standard is that we're working on. But the potential of the standard can actually get over to here, all the way over to DOK4 extended thinking if I'm using multiple pieces of text, right? And I'm actually having to draw and justify my conclusions. So if I move past my summary into doing something else, and really in this strategy, we're really staying at that DOK2 Bloom level 2, right? But I could take it as far as if I used multiple pieces of text all the way over to DOK4 Bloom level 5. If I change that summary to something higher, which was don't just summarize, but also draw conclusions. So we want to look for the potential of various strategies that we're going through. So in our strategy chart, we're going to put in definitely DOK1 and 2, but could go as high as DOK4 Bloom level 5 evaluate. Okay, so I hope this part was helpful. In the next part, I want to talk about stage 2 of Cogno. So last week I talked about stage 1 in the prioritization schematic, but in stage 2, what we do is we ask schools to give us their calendar. We input that so that when teachers are planning, they can say, how many units of instruction would you like to have for these standards? They can say, oh, we're 4th grade, we're going to use 6 units for this science work that we're going to do this year, or we're going to use 4 so that we mark all of our grading. They have the choice of how many units they want, and so the time is drawn there that allows them to see the actual instructional time they have, pulling out all kinds of events and all kinds of assessments, and we know students are tested to death. And so when we're looking at that, we have to put those assessment calendars in there as well, right? What happens then is they take the standards after they've prioritized them and they say, all right, in this schematic, I have 8 units that I want to use. And so now I'm just plopping those standards into these units just by using checkboxes. I don't have to do anything else. I'm just putting them in there. This used to be really time consuming when we did it by hand. The next and most important and significant part of Cogno stage 2 is the back mapping of rigor. So in stage 1, they had to identify the target level of rigor of the standard. But from an instructional standpoint with rigor, we want to say, okay, you chose this as the target. So here's DOK3, Bloom level 4. How are you going to back map this along the way so that we're not skipping steps for students as they are digesting this information? So what the tool does is it says, Let's take it first at the weekly level. You've got your prioritized standards. What weeks do you want to back map the level of rigor? And then it moves from how do we look at our priority standards and the ones that we want to back map so that we take it from the weekly level to the daily level. And teachers may say, hey, I'm only going to do this on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Or I'm only going to do this on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, or only on Monday and Tuesday, or however they want to scaffold, right? But it's up to them to try to make these predictions about how they're going to back map the standards. Eventually, there's a planning piece where it shows the culmination of their work. And the only thing they have to do is input the locally relevant connections, the how, why, or what if types of questions that are going to lead students to those locally relevant connections based on whatever it is they're teaching, curriculum resources, and then it moves it to the daily level. Notice down at the bottom that you have instructional strategies, but it's going to ask teachers eventually to label them before, during, after, or possibly community builder. For administrators, there is a feedback page where they can go through, they've gone through and they're doing a formative walkthrough. They can just punch the button on the day, they'll see where the teacher is, and then there are 5 questions they could potentially answer. They don't have to answer all 5. Maybe they just want to answer 1, maybe just wows and wonders, right? But at least they have evidence of where teachers are and where the level of rigor is so that we get greater levels of leadership coaching and greater levels of task-specific feedback. Now, also notice that as we're looking at this, there is another page that comes after this where teachers are able to respond to this feedback that they get. So we're really kind of bringing the feedback loop full tilt so that administrators are watching the lessons, teachers are giving the lessons, they have the feedback, and then teachers are giving feedback on the feedback. So that's really closing that feedback loop, right? Next week, we're going to be looking at using rigor for assessment. And I will now take any questions you might have. Otherwise, you can send questions to Dr. B. Dubeck at evolutionalliance.education. Okay, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the week, great weekend.